Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Look at how markets are digesting the latest salvo from President Trump when it comes to the chair of the Fed, Jerome Powell. The pressure he is piling on him not going anywhere, in fact, amplifying it once again today on Truth Social. Of course, it's not unusual to see the president weighing in on Fed policy, or this chairman in particular. You can see examples of that going back as far as his first administration in 2018. But maybe a bit remarkable today, Joe, to see him directly suggesting there could be a slowdown in the U.S. economy if the chair doesn't do as he wants and cut rates, perhaps preemptively.
In all caps, there can be a slowing, he says, of the economy unless Mr. Too Late, a major loser, lowers interest rates. Now, as Charlie Pellet mentioned, it's Marathon Monday, Patriots Day in Boston. At the White House, it's Easter egg roll day. Easter Monday, we'll call it, and that is where we start right now with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. She's on the north lawn of the White House. Tyler, I know the president was with the Easter Bunny a little while ago. He did make some remarks. Has he talked about these markets at all?
Yeah, Joe, at the moment, we've yet to get any indication on exactly if the White House is watching the markets in reaction to his most recent criticism of Jerome Powell, going as far as to say that the U.S. economy could slow if the Fed doesn't move to cut rates and quickly. It does appear, as we see growth forecasts starting to be decline across the globe, that this White House could be potentially preparing to shift some of the blame for the impacts of his tariff policies onto the Federal Reserve. Now, Joe, of course, the biggest question here is whether or not this White House actually has the legal authority to remove Powell. And if you ask the Fed chair himself, he would say that he doesn't think he can be fired and that he wouldn't step aside if he was asked to do so. In theory, Powell is supposed to be shielded from being fired without cause by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, but there are some big questions, as you know, here in Washington about the future of independent federal regulators. We're watching very closely one case that could be decided by the Supreme Court within days that has to do with another independent regulator when it comes to the National Labor Relations Board, and this administration asking the courts to overturn legal precedent known as Humphrey's executor, which would shield independent agencies from political firings. We'll have to see what ends up happening with that, because it is considered to be a test case, as President Trump doesn't appear to be letting up the pressure as he ties this very closely to his tariff policies. And as the tariff negotiations get underway, you mentioned this at the top of the hour, but Bloomberg News reporting there's going to be a key meeting here at the White House later on with some big retailers. That includes Home Depot, Walmart, Lowe's, and Target, as the private sector also tries to get into these talks as the White House attempts to cut some deals when it comes to his tariff policies.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House. Thank you so much. And the stock of some of those very retailers that Tyler was mentioning under pressure today, as we're seeing a wider sell-off in the equity markets. We're now down more than 3 full percentage points on both the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ 100. And on that note, we turn to Gina Martin-Adams, Bloomberg Intelligence Chief Equity Strategist, joining us from New York. Gina, when you look at the renewed selling pressure once again today, is it so much that markets are actively reacting to the news or the suggestions about the future of the Fed Chair Jerome Powell, or they just don't see another compelling reason to be buying instead of selling?
Yeah, I think that those are two very valid reasons that are coming up all day today. But the third, I'd say, is earnings season. So far, 65% of S&P 500 companies that have reported much lower sales than expected by the analyst community. And that was in the first quarter, before we had Liberation Day really rock S&P 500 companies' world. So I do think that kind of earnings are playing a role as well. The dollar is also playing a role. The fact that the dollar is falling when the S&P 500 is falling is a very rare thing, particularly when the S&P is this weak. To have the dollar also weakening is creating a lot of concern in the form of financial markets concern that broadly investors are losing a little bit of faith in the system itself. So there's quite a few things, frankly, that investors are having to contend with. I think the other thing that I would note is we're coming off of excessive overconfidence. When we came into this year, markets were pricing for greater than 20% earnings growth emerging. Now we're looking at closer to zero as the potential run rate, if not a contraction in earnings, depending upon how this 90-day reprieve plays out. So the markets have just been really sideswiped and certainly taken by surprise so far this year.
So where's the safe haven right now, Gene? I mean, is it gold, Bitcoin? Is that it?
Yeah, I think that international equities also have already priced a significant amount of weakness. They didn't come into this year as overconfident as U.S. equities did. International equities priced at extreme discounts relative to U.S. equities, and currencies there generally rallying would suggest a very alternative. We did a note this morning talking about EM equities as a potential safe haven, where even the downside risk in China is somewhat limited by even a U.S. recession in comparison to the downside risk to the U.S. market. Part of that is where stocks were priced in each market coming into this year. Very similarly, you see EM countries across the world less correlated to the U.S. markets than they had been in the past. So low beta markets tend to offer some degree of safe haven. Certainly consumer staples and utility stocks, and the sectors that behave more defensively, low beta sectors tend to perform a little bit better in sell-offs like this. There are relative safe havens, but unfortunately most equities are going to struggle in a climate like this one.
Gina, it's great to have you. Gina Martin-Adams, Bloomberg Intelligence Chief Equity Strategist. As we follow stocks lower, we'll have an update from Charlie Pellet in just a little bit more than 10 minutes from right now. But we are reaching to lows for the day here. 3% plus losses for the S&P 500 and the NASDAQ right now. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington alongside Kaylee Lines. This is Balance of Power. The news coming out of Washington has so much to do with what's happening right now on Wall Street, and it's where we start our conversation with Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis, the Republican from New York's 11th District, with us live from World Headquarters in New York. And Congresswoman, we want to welcome you back, as always, to Bloomberg TV and radio. Do you worry about the intersection in this case of Washington and Wall Street? The words of the president, or at least as he posted on Truth Social, appear to be pulling us lower here, referring to the Fed chair as a major loser, even though he did appoint him initially. This is the impact of the rhetoric in American politics now, no?
Look, I think that we need to be focused on governing with a confident, steady hand here. I think the most important thing that we can be doing is making sure that we pass this very important tax package, that we prevent an expiration of the existing 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act. That in itself, I think, is something that can send a very strong message that we get back to Washington next week and we see pieces of this bills being furnished by the individual committees. I think there's a question right now around the world whether we can get the job done. I believe that we can and we must, or else it's a $4 trillion tax hike, and you'll see a lot of the provisions that were so important to the American economy expire, right? We have so many things at stake here. You have interest deductibility, R&D, expensing, you have bonus depreciation, you have the corporate tax rate that would go from 21% to 35% if this were to expire. And of course, the other provisions that lifted millions of Americans out of poverty, that created 7 million jobs. There's a lot here, and we need to make sure that we not only pass it, but that we expand it in a way that we add more pro-growth policies so we can see the economy really prosper, and repatriation of manufacturing is another big component of this as well that I've been working on.
Well, and we know, Congresswoman, that any expansion of tax cuts will require offsets based off of the kind of framework that the House is working with here. So it becomes a question of the spending cuts. I'm sure you're well aware that the House Energy and Commerce Committee is going to begin marking up its portion of this massive reconciliation bill, and that will be the Medicaid question. Have you seen a list of proposals or any kind of draft around what exactly will be put forward when it comes to Medicaid, knowing you have looked for assurances on that front? Do you expect you'll see one before the markup?
Well, what we have seen is the menu of options, right? And we're talking about the entire energy and healthcare portfolio. So it's not just Medicaid. It obviously deals with regulations. It deals with broadband spectrum sales. It deals with other components. Emission vehicles, things like that, that could be offsets. With the Medicaid piece, we've made it very clear to the Speaker, to the Chairman of this committee, as well as to the President of the United States, that there is a group of us that will not support any package that would diminish, meaning taking individuals who are legally eligible for Medicaid off the rolls. If they are eligible, they need to be able to keep their eligibility. Now, aside from that, and specifically, we're talking about our senior citizens, our people with disabilities, children with developmental disabilities, pregnant women. These are people that we are really laser focused on. Yes, we can implement work requirements on people that are able-bodied. They should be contributing in this economy and working. That would remove them off of Medicaid and put them on most likely private insurance, saving the government money as well. And of course, the fraud, getting rid of it, which accounts for roughly $50 billion a year in Medicaid alone. That's $500 billion over 10 years. So when you're looking for a savings of roughly $880 billion over 10 years, that's a big chunk of it right there that we're going to save. Yeah. And so we've just made very clear that in terms of reimbursement rates for our states, New York, for example, 50% federal reimbursement, we will not allow that to be lowered. So that was one thing that we pushed back on, as well as per capita caps on traditional Medicaid. That's something that we've also said is a red line for us. And we've received positive feedback from the Speaker and a commitment that they're not going to touch those things.
That's really interesting. We saw your letter to House leadership on this last week, Congresswoman. There's been a lot of talk about a millionaire's tax, and I wonder if that's something you might warm up to if it means not rating Medicaid.
Well, it's certainly on the table. It's being considered. We have to make sure that we have a tax structure that is fair. Obviously, the president has a lot of priorities, which we share. We want to see working class, middle class communities get some relief. We want to see the SALT cap increase, the deduction increase for people that I represent here in New York who are struggling with high property taxes and income taxes as well. We want to make sure that we're protecting our seniors who are on Social Security and that they're not having to pay taxes on their small Social Security checks. And so if we want to do these things, then we need to find the money to offset it. And so we're looking at every option on the table. I think that we're having serious discussions about where this money is going to come from. And that's one of the options that is currently out there. But we also want to make sure that we're preserving the other various aspects of the TCJA that were so critical for our economy, that created jobs, allowed companies to expand and invest, and repatriate manufacturers. Another big piece of this that we're very much focused on. How do we give a lower rate for new facilities that are built here or expanded here to create and manufacture, so we can repatriate some of this stuff that's happening overseas, in particular pharmaceuticals, that we're relying on communist China for such a huge portion of our medication here in the United States. That has to end. If we've learned anything from COVID, must be a priority in this package.
Congresswoman, as you talk about the various options here, is one of the options being considered taxing carried interest as ordinary income? Is that something you would support if it's on the table?
Well, that is one of the proposals that the White House has put forward. They do want to address the carried interest. This is something that we've heard a lot from people in opposition. Obviously, the real estate industry, venture capitalists, very concerned about the carried interest proposal. It's on the table, but we are still evaluating this and other options. The other thing that has been on the table, which we met with many real estate industry individuals here in New York today, actually was about the sea salt, corporate salt for property taxes, for income taxes here in the state. This one in particular is very concerning because the real estate industry cannot bear to have the sea salt removed, basically, or imposed on the property portion. So if they start seeing that they can't deduct this business expense from their federal taxes, it will put really a big burden on these real estate companies, these buildings, and we'll see maybe foreclosures, we'll see property values decline, which will then reduce the rolls that our local government receives on property taxes. So I think that's a big one that I've been pushing back on just as a member from New York City. It could be very detrimental to our city, but it affects municipalities all across the country, particularly those states that don't have an income tax. States like Texas and Florida rely a lot on real estate taxes.
Congresswoman, we only have a minute left. I'm curious, did you pay a congestion tax to get to our studio earlier today? I thought it was coming down on April 20th, per order the Transportation Department.
Well, unfortunately, our governor and the MTA want to continue to violate federal law, and so I was forced to pay that fee, but I hope not for long. And I was very happy to hear President Trump and Secretary Duffy today say that they're giving them just one more month, or else they're going to look at other measures to try to penalize the state and the MTA for not complying with federal law. The president was right to rescind that approval from Joe Biden. That was basically a rubber stamp without the environmental impact statement required under NEPA. That is why I am among those who have sued the MTA and the state. We hope that they comply because it's an unfair cash grab on the people I represent.
All right, we'll leave it there. Congresswoman, thank you, as always, for your time. That is Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York, joining us from our global headquarters in New York. Meantime, we'll continue the conversation here in Washington. Our political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, are just ahead here on a sell-off day on Wall Street on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Thanks for being here on the fastest show in politics. Bloomberg Radio is far-reaching, not just Boston, not just here in Washington on 99.1, but of course nationwide on Sirius XM channel 121 and on YouTube. Find us as ever by searching Bloomberg Business News Live. On Patriots Day, at least in some states, in Washington, D.C., of course, well, it's another day to be watching the markets here. With Charlie's help, we'll keep doing that through the program after Donald Trump took to Truth Social to call Jay Powell a loser. But it's an interesting day here as we consider the full Ginsburg. I, by the way, did check. They have already updated the full Ginsburg wiki page to put Senator Chris Van Hollen there as the latest to pull off this remarkable feat. All the Sunday shows live. Does anyone actually know who Ginsburg's? William Ginsburg was Monica Lewinsky's lawyer. Anyway, for the old people. The reason why he was out there is because he actually got some time in El Salvador with Mr. Abrego Garcia. You saw the images, I'm sure, over the weekend. Were those margaritas? Yeah, they were pretty close to the swimming pool at Chris Van Hollen's hotel. But he said it was a mission accomplished moment for him to simply get time with Mr. Abrego Garcia. Over the weekend, the Supreme Court issued a ruling, by the way, halting all Alien Enemies Act-based deportations. And it's interesting when you read the writing. The court indicating a deep skepticism, this is a quote, a deep skepticism about whether the administration could be trusted to live up to the key part of an earlier ruling after the government had deported a different group of migrants to a prison in El Salvador. So we'll see where this goes here. The administration is not budging, and you don't need to look any further than Sunday morning TV to watch that. The aforementioned Chris Van Hollen, the gentleman from Maryland, on ABC This Week. Listen.
What Donald Trump is trying to do here is change the subject. The subject at hand is that he and his administration are defying a court order to give Abrego Garcia his due process rights. They are trying to litigate on social media what they should be doing in the courts. They need to put up or shut up in the courts.
Two most important words you just heard, due process, right? He referred to due process rights. That's the way Democrats are getting to this. The administration says, hey, we're trying to get bad guys out of the country here. Are you serious? You want to bring this guy back for due process? Tom Homan was asked about this. The president's border czar was also out on Sunday morning television. Here's Tom Homan on CNN.
I stand by the fact I think we did the right thing here. We removed a public safety threat, a national security threat, a violent gang member for the United States. ICE intelligence says he's an MS-13 gang member. A confidential informant says he's an MS-13 gang member. The country of El Salvador says he's an MS-13 gang member. I think he's exactly where he should be.
Okay. Get ready for the parade of lawmakers, Democrats specifically, in San Salvador now that Van Hollen has done so. Now, by the way, they're not all going to get full Ginsburgs. 4 House Democrats are on their way. Robert Garcia, California, Maxwell Frost, Florida, Maxine Dexter, Oregon, Yasmin Ansari, Arizona. Meeting with officials at the embassy in El Salvador, receiving classified briefings, we read. There was a request to make these official delegations, and apparently that request was denied. Let's assemble our panel. They're back with us on a Monday. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors. He is our Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie is our Democratic analyst and political science professor at Iona University. Jeannie, I don't know your thoughts on Chris Van Hollen. The administration says he was played, and he was even asked about that in some of these interviews. He says, no, I wasn't played. Yeah, they tried to get a nice beauty shot of us out there by the pool, but the fact is I went down there to meet with him, and I succeeded. Was it time well spent? Was it worth it?
You know, I think it was. I do think that Gavin Newsom is on to something, as is Richie Torres, that the Democrats have to be a little cautious here and they can't get sidetracked. The reality is just what you talked about, Joe. This is not about Abrego Garcia. This is about due process and following the rules and the orders of the Supreme Court and the federal courts in the country and the law. Plain and simple. Beyond that, the real story of the day and the year for Democrats has got to be the chaos in our financial system and the impact it is having on their constituents at home where they live. So, but that doesn't mean you can't do both. So, I don't know if everybody needs to go down there. There's a little bit of a cattle mentality. It is fine to go down there, but the reality is follow the law, Mr. President and administration, and please, please fix the financial chaos in the markets and don't contribute to it, even though you set it off, pull it back.
Does Chris Van Hollen look smart this morning or not, Rick Davis? And I ask you that having heard from you last week. You described occasions when John McCain would go visit a place where leadership may not want him to be. Was this good politics, or was he played by the administration?
Yeah, he did what John McCain exemplified, throughout his career, which is one man can make a difference. John McCain showed up in a bunch of really threatening places, demanded to see political prisoners, put away, talked about democracy. I mean, he had a different reason for doing what he was doing. But Chris Van Hollen showed that one person getting on a plane and showing up can create a controversy. And I think that's all he was trying to do, is keep that issue alive. Make the point to the American public and to the media that regardless of whether or not you know anything about Mr. Garcia, he has not gone through a process, a due process, and that is the issue. And it was echoed by the courts, as you pointed out earlier, even the Supreme Court halting Venezuelans from being deported. There needs to be a real conversation around the implementation of these emergency powers that Donald Trump has done as to whether or not they're appropriate in the world we live in today. And to be able to say I can deport anybody I want to, regardless of whether they've been convicted of a crime or given due process, is just not, what we think of as being lawful in a community of people. And that's what Chris Van Hollen plugged into today, this weekend.
Jeannie, you mentioned the two causes here, this being one and the economy essentially being the other, the economic policies or lack thereof, depending on who you speak with coming out of this White House, the reason why the market is down sharply again today. Enter Hakeem Jeffries' cost of living week of action. He also was on Sunday morning TV talking about this, Jeannie. A cost of living week of action. We have to continue to talk to the American people about our plans. Who's listening?
Well, Americans are, and he's absolutely right. I have to admit, Joe, I am not a huge fan of these week designations because it always brings me back to our infrastructure weeks, and, it just has a bad feel. But he's absolutely right. That is what the Democrats and Republicans, by the way, this is not party oriented, need to focus on, which is what Americans are experiencing right now. And the real message from Democrats has got to be all of the chaos and all of the craziness and all of the messiness that, by the way, got Abrego Garcia down there and has gotten us into this mess with the economy is because we have a president who is completely undisciplined. So while Americans may have voted for him and appreciate what he said he was going to do, what he has done in just 90 days is create chaos in almost every major department of our government and every single issue people care about, whether it's foreign policy, whether it is the economy, whether it is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. That's what they need to focus on. So Hakeem Jeffries' instinct here is right. Democrats need to show the American public that they hear them when they say this kind of what some people are calling a clown show cannot continue as it pertains to the financial way in which the president seems to be running the government. And the latest we hear, of course, are absolutely insane things like one person is out of the office, another person comes in, talks to him, and he signs a 90-day reprieve on tariffs. That is no way to implement serious policy.
The president was talking earlier at the White House Easter egg roll, Rick Davis, about military enlistment going through the roof. He was, I guess, making some reference to the Pentagon on a day when Pete Hegseth is under attack. And he talked about the economy doing so well under his watch. You've got the Dow Industrial Average down 1,000 points, which is something that people actually talk about when they go to work here. This is going to be the conversation right now at lunches all around the country, whether people can afford to go out or they're eating at their desks or whatever it is. This is the backdrop to everything else that we're talking about here. I'm looking at you here on YouTube with a big red headline across the bottom of the page here. S&P 500 slumps as Trump reiterates call for lower interest rates. The corrosive effect here of what's happening in the stock market is hard to overstate, and it makes us question everything else that we're looking at. What does Donald Trump think about this as he's sitting in the Oval right now?
Look, I mean, he's got a financial plan that even by his own description was going to cause some pain. I think that he probably hadn't anticipated as much pain being inflicted on people who own stocks and bonds in this country. Is that what's happened? The reality is he really owes it to the American public to use that bully pulpit to go on TV and explain how all these things that he's doing in the financial sector is going to somehow benefit them in the short, medium, and long run. We've seen the collapse of consumer confidence since he was elected president, collapse of the stock market, collapse of the bond market. I mean, how many presidents have ever been able to withstand this, incredibly fast change toward the negative on people's, 401ks and other things without addressing that to the American public, and there is a growing chorus that this is all self-inflicted, that we had a roaring economy coming into Donald Trump. Everyone thought that would just be put on steroids, and in fact, we've had exactly the opposite. So I think the guy's got to go have a conversation with the American public. No more rallies. Sit behind that desk and have a conversation as to how these tariff regimes and how his threats to remove Jay Powell are somehow good for our economy.
Boy, imagine an Oval Office, a primetime Oval Office address from the president on script. It actually would be quite a moment for him as he calls the Fed chair a major loser. If you're wondering why the markets are tumbling today and what we're talking about, this post on Truth Social by Donald Trump, there can be a slowing, he says, of the economy, essentially predicting an economic slowdown unless Mr. Too Late, a major loser, lowers interest rates now. The President of the United States on this Easter Monday, 2025.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Day 90, by the way, if you're playing along on your home game of the second Trump administration, with another 1,000-point drop in the Dow after the president takes to Truth Social to call Jay Powell a loser. Now, if you're trying to clean things up, say at the Pentagon, following a very difficult weekend, a series of hit pieces, do you go to the White House Easter egg roll to do it? Do you enlist the Easter Bunny? Because that is essentially what happened today. A short time ago, Pete Hegseth, rebounding from a couple of very difficult pieces of reporting, one in the New York Times, the other in Politico, suggesting there's another signal chat, that it's a Pentagon in disarray. He's been pretty busy on the phone, it turns out. Unless you ask the defense secretary, who denied that reporting a short time ago on the White House lawn as the kids were rolling the Easter eggs. Watch and listen.
This is what the media does. They take anonymous sources from disgruntled former employees, and then they try to slash and burn people and ruin their reputations. Not going to work with me, because we're changing the Defense Department, putting the Pentagon back in the hands of warfighters, and anonymous smears from disgruntled former employees on old news doesn't matter.
I mean, I suspect he wouldn't have had the horn playing if he was at the Pentagon, right? You get a full soundtrack over there. Everybody seemed to be in a great mood at the Easter egg roll. Even Don Jr. was there blowing the golden whistle. First Lady was there holding hands with Donald Trump. Not exactly the forum you would expect to find the defense secretary in today. Here's a quote for you. There are very likely more shoes to drop in short order, with even bigger bombshell stories coming this week. That's from a guy named John Elliott, left the Defense Department last week, former Defense Department official. He was responsible for one of the two hit pieces, taking an op-ed at Politico there to refer to a Pentagon in disarray. Tony Capaccio makes his living over there at the Pentagon and sees all this stuff up close, was prolific with us about the first signal chat, and he's back now with another. Here on the other side of the river, Bloomberg Pentagon reporter Tony Capaccio. You know, you got a big following online. People always look forward to you coming over here. Maybe it's because I'm usually calling you about a very large and controversial story.
It's flattering, but it doesn't go to my head.
No, I don't know about that. But you wonder, you start hearing the questions, how long is he going to last? This is like a rerun here, and the White House is digging in. He says basically that it's untrue, it's fake news. The White House says they're going to stand by their man. We just had 4 very important departures at the Pentagon the end of last week. You can't deny that part. This is a big problem.
Right. And not only they happened Friday, so he had 3 people. Mm-hmm. 2 of them were very close to him. They worked for him at the Concerned Veterans for America. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Dan Caldwell not only worked there, I didn't realize this, but he actually helped vet people for Hexeth when Hexeth was confirmed. He was a handholder, it said, who selected people who would work for Hexeth. Yeah. Uh-huh. Very close. Very close. So Friday, he came out with a Twitter feed criticizing the removal.
A joint statement.
A joint statement for the 3 people. Mm-hmm. Friday at midday, or late afternoon, the New York Times comes out with a story about the second signal channel. And then at 7 p.m., John Elliott's editorial was posted on Politico. It seemed pretty coordinated, like the Revenge of the Jedi, if you're a Star Wars fan.
But these guys were shown the door, presumably, for leaking already, right? So they've got more to leak.
That's you saying that, not me.
Okay. Were they not alleged to have been, or is that simply reported?
They're alleged to have been leaking. I'm not going to put a correlate, but two and two together on these stories. But your viewers are smart.
You have to be careful who you fire sometimes.
It all comes out. The 7 p.m. Politico thing was kind of that. It showed me it was moderately coordinated.
Dan Caldwell, Darren Selnick, Colin Carroll, and the aforementioned John Elliott. What's he talking about with more bombshells to drop this week?
I kind of know, but I'm not going to say.
Really?
Yeah. I don't think it's this week.
How long does this barrage continue then?
So I think here's a couple things. He's at the Easter egg roll today.
Yeah. I
think a lot of Washington is going to be wondering what rolls next.
Okay.
From the shoulder up. In 2 weeks, he'll be before the Senate Armed Services Committee on a military posture hearing. This may be his make or break moment because he's going to get shot at from various venues. And the president's chief of staff, Susan Wiles.
Susan Wiles, yeah.
Susan Wiles. She's going to be watching that closely because she's done kind of a key, from what I understand, to his survival. If she thinks he's a liability, he could go. One thing I want to make the point, though, too, it's a good thing the United States doesn't have a national security crisis at the moment. Panama and the canal issue is not a military crisis. Going after the Houthis is not a military crisis. It's a good thing there's not a major crisis where U.S. troops are heavily involved.
Hexeth, before we heard the remarks we just heard on the lawn, took to Twitter. This was on Easter night, 10:45 p.m. This is Easter. Your agenda is illegals, trans, and DEI, all of which are no longer allowed at DOD. He was responding to a Democratic Party tweet suggesting that he stepped down. Mm-hmm. This is not an administration that's looking to have a conversation about this. He could survive for some time, no?
He could survive for some time as long as these are similar allegations. If there's some new thing out of out of
it
left
would
field.
take something classified. The White House says still not classified. He's putting out timing on F-18s flying to Yemen here, which is pretty remarkable. Not unlike we saw in the chats that were shared with the Atlantic. Flight schedules for the F-18 Hornets targeting the Houthis in Yemen. That's not fireable.
It's not fireable if you're this administration, but that's a key piece of information. If you're a more sophisticated adversary than the Houthis, who could have intercepted that and cued their air defenses to shoot down those non-stealthy F-18s.
4 guys are shown the door like this, several of them at least close to Pete Hegseth until now. What does that do for morale inside the Pentagon?
My understanding that it's being the words I'm hearing. This is a clown show. This is
clown show.
Yeah, this is one exact quote. From a business standpoint, from a Bloomberg audience standpoint, Colin Carroll's demise is particularly interesting because he was Stephen Feinberg's chief of staff, his handholder, his scheduler, his funnel for information about a building he knows nothing about. But my understanding is that Mr. Feinberg is being fire hosed with information. And so he's absorbing and learning. But he's going to be out there on his own. From the Bloomberg audience standpoint, this is the key kind of appointment they should be watching in terms of who the next chief of staff is, because Mr. Feinberg's policies could have major impact on companies.
On procurement.
On procurement, acquisition, the lash up with Silicon Valley. This is a kind of a key constituency for Bloomberg audience and the business industrial, the defense industrial base in general.
Fascinating. Are we on the verge of an announcement? And I'm not trying to change the subject here, but I wonder if this could actually turn our focus at the Pentagon, the announcement of the next generation Navy fighter jet.
No, I don't see there as a correlation. My understanding, I was following this pretty closely until about a week ago. It's held up at the Pentagon level in terms of funding issues.
Okay.
How do you pay for it in the 26 through 30 budget?
Imminent.
I don't think there's a connection between
what could
the two.
be imminent is the first $1 trillion defense budget by the time they're done with this reconciliation bill. Do you see it happening?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go too far overboard. It's because Secretary Austin, on his way out, in the story we broke, suggested about $1 trillion for FY26 and hitting $1 trillion by 27.
Well, that's a far cry from Doge, knocking the stuffing out of the Pentagon. I thought defense stocks were falling out of bed a couple of weeks ago because Elon Musk was going to eliminate all these programs. You're suggesting it'd be bigger than ever.
It was Austin's idea, and the Trumpies are following it.
Okay, well, we'll see, I guess, what Pete Hegseth has to say about that. The testimony that you mentioned is important. It's 2 weeks away.
Roughly 2 weeks away.
You're either going to see some real bad stories between now and then, or something actually move, something change in the leadership of the Pentagon, no?
My sense is you'll see more bad stories, but this is going to be a theater. Chairman Wicker is probably going to have to show some tough love and lay into him.
Yeah.
There's going to be all eyes on how Hegseth performs, how defensive he gets, how offensive he gets, how linear are his explanations. He's going to take a lot of slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Is that what they say?
Well, yeah, if you're getting poetic on us now. You wonder where Donald Trump is with all of this. They tend to have Caroline Leavitt, press secretary, somebody go out and say something nice. He did speak today about enlistment being at a record high level. He's standing there literally with the Easter Bunny up on the balcony talking about this. He didn't mention Pete Hegseth, but it's
the numbers have gone up.
Not a question as to why.
The numbers have gone up. It's pretty impressive, but they have gone up.
And
it's whether the retention, though, whether they actually, you want to watch those numbers, the retention numbers, and how many people leave the service over the next year.
Is this the best thing that happened to Michael Waltz recently?
I mean,
funny, they've been keeping him real quiet since the first signal chat.
Because it diverts attention from his signal chat.
Sure. I don't mean to get conspiratorial on you here, but he's been very quiet. Haven't heard that name in a lot.
He has not been on the talk shows. This is true. They had a flurry of EO executive orders a couple of weeks ago that he had some hand in. So I think they're still basking in that afterglow.
He was at the cabinet room table sitting next to the boss for Giorgia Maloney's visit. That was the first time I've seen him kind of a place of prominence. Today, though, it's Pete Hegseth and the Easter Bunny. You imagine seeing Leon Panetta, William Cullen hanging around the Easter Bunny doing something like that today?
I can't
Don
even
Rumsfeld.
imagine. Or Rumsfeld in particular. That would be an incongruous image.
There are knowable unknowables.
No,
Mr.
unknown
Capaccio.
unknowns. Yeah.
Fair enough. Thanks for coming to talk to us.
Thank
I can't
you.
imagine what you're going to have next, but let us know when you find out. with us from the Pentagon. He's nodding if you're listening on the radio. Tony Capaccio, our great Pentagon reporter, with the latest from what we're told is a Pentagon in disarray.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
White House Easter egg roll day on this day after the holiday. And it was interesting to see not only the president doing the usual, interacting with the Easter Bunny, the First Lady, of course, there as well. There was book reading, there was some coloring, but there was also some talking with reporters for President Trump, who answered a number of questions, of course, in part defending his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, who we were just discussing, but also was fielding questions, Joe, about efforts toward ending the war in Ukraine. When he was asked specifically by a reporter if he thought a deal between Russia and Ukraine could be made this week, he says he thinks there's a good chance.
Pretty remarkable stuff. We were talking about a minerals deal potentially being signed this week. You were talking about the whole shebang now, and it follows reporting over the weekend, some reporting from Bloomberg, in fact, that there might be some particulars here in a deal that Ukraine would have trouble with, including codifying Crimea as the Russian homeland. Joining us to talk about this and a lot of other stories that are impacting today with a new look potentially at the State Department coming from this administration. Michael Allen, Managing Director, Beacon Global Strategies, and of course, former Special Assistant to President George W. Bush in the national security space. It's always great to have you, Michael. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
To see a deal signed this week would be pretty remarkable. This, of course, is the war that the president said that he would bring to an end in his first day. This is day 90. That would mean he gets it done on the first 100 days. Is it possible?
Well, it's been pending out here for a while. Ukraine has said they will accept a 30-day ceasefire. The Russians, of course, except for the Easter Day ceasefire, have not been willing to go that far. But if the reporting is true, which is that the White House is open to describing Crimea as Russian, and maybe there are other inducements in there, perhaps as it pertains to sanctions, maybe as it pertains to no, never, Ukraine cannot get in NATO. I think it's conceivable that they could get there. But to me, remember, there's a long spectrum between ceasefire and peace agreement. And so all these issues are going to have to be discussed again.
Well, and I wonder if resolution to these issues doesn't happen this week, if you expect the administration will stay on the table, because let's remind ourselves of the words of the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, just on Friday.
Now we've reached a point where we have other things we have to focus on. We're prepared to be engaged in this as long as it takes, but not indefinitely, not without progress. If this is not possible, we're going to need to move on. I think the president feels strongly that we've dedicated we've done more in 80 days than Biden ever did to bring this war to an end.
Not indefinitely. So if it's not this week, is it not ever?
It feels like he's leaving himself some room to continue after it, but I think they badly need some sort of points on the board this week, and I think they're probably doubling down to get to the 30-day ceasefire so that Trump can point to some progress in this. Otherwise, I think what we're going to see is just continued bloodshed on either side. I have my own doubts, by the way, about whether the Russians are really going to adhere to a ceasefire. I think it'll be sloppy, but we're just going to have to see what they come up with.
Well, it's quite an evolution to go from I can end this war in the first day to having still really no clear path on day 90. Did President Trump misread Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think there's also got to be some sort of recognition on the White House side that some of these might be insoluble issues. After all, Putin wants to control Ukraine, not just its territory, but to dominate its foreign and national security policy. This is something, of course, that the Ukrainians could never agree to. The Ukrainians cannot, by the way, either agree to a formal recognition of some of their territories, even those that the Russians don't actually control today, as formally part of Russia under some fiction that there are Russian speakers there. So I think there are a lot of fundamental issues that they're going to take months to get to, if ever.
Bloomberg is reporting today, Michael, that the U.S. is likely to hold talks in London on Wednesday with not just Ukrainian officials, but European officials as well, from the UK, France, and Germany. What role should we expect Europe is going to play as this moves forward?
Well, they have felt locked out of the process so far, so I'm glad that Secretary Rubio, over the last few days, has begun to think of a role for them. I think for those of us that kind of want to see Ukraine's interests more represented, it's good to have these European nations involved. After all, Trump is saying this is your security problem in the long term. So they need to have some sort of role. They need to be there on the takeoff if Trump wants them to be there on the landing. So let's figure out a way to get them involved, get them motivated, because they're the ones that are going to have to supply a lot of this security assurance.
Iran talks will continue as long as there's another meeting. Is this progress?
I don't think so.
No?
I think there's a lot of delay inherent, and I think what really has happened over the last couple of weeks is that Steve Witkoff went in. I think he was agreeable. I think some of the things that the United States is willing to do was exaggerated. People came back last week. I think they stiffened some spines, and the United States is back to a tougher Iran policy, which is we don't want enrichment to continue, and we're not going to just give up on inspections of weaponization. We talked about this last week.
Yeah.
You have to have anytime, anywhere inspections by the International Watchdog Agency, and that has got to be part and parcel of anything going forward.
So if ultimately a deal is to be reached, how akin will it be to the original deal from 2015 that President Trump walked away from?
That's what makes this so hard for the Trump team. It would seemingly be easier to sign up to something that just looks like what Barack Obama did and maybe add a few years. But that will look terrible because President Trump called that the worst deal ever negotiated in the history of the world. And so they're going to have to come up with something that's stronger. And when the hawks get involved, like Marco Rubio, like Mike Waltz, they're saying we shouldn't have any enrichment whatsoever, and we ought to be able to have some assurances that you're not thereby trying to weaponize resultant fissile material to fashion it into a bomb. Those are big things we're asking for. They're the right things, but that's something that Iran's not going to be able to accept anytime soon. So we've got to let maximum pressure play out over time. By the way, I don't know why we're in such a rush. I think there is some time to let Iran bake in sort of the sanctions oven for a while.
Interesting. We're having this conversation amid another scandal at the Pentagon. The White House is calling it fake news now by NPR that the president is looking for a new defense secretary. But it's no wonder why we're having reports like this today. Another signal chat is being reported by the New York Times in which Pete Hegseth shared these Yemeni attack plans with his wife and some other folks in his personal life. Also follows the departure of 4 officials at the Pentagon last week, fired for alleged media leaks. One of them is John Elliott, although I believe he also wanted to leave the Pentagon here. You can frame that as you want. Left the department last week with an op-ed over the weekend. Pentagon is in disarray under Hegseth's leadership. Is he right?
He needs, I think Hegseth needs to come out and actually demonstrate that he's in control of the department. I think one way to do that might be to come out and actually brief the Pentagon press corps. Talk about the things that he's trying to do. He's often talking about increasing the lethality of the force. There are big questions about DOGE. There are big questions about where the department is on these foreign policy issues of the day. I think that would be the best way for Hegseth to try and demonstrate that he has control, that he has strength, that he has some strong policy views, and that he's doing all these things in service of the president. I think to just totally dismiss everything as a hoax is sort of beyond the point. He ought to come out and talk about, hey, here's what I'm trying to do, and sign up to that.
But even if he is trying to do all of those things, is it not disqualifying to share the whereabouts of American airmen, the plans for F-18 flights in Yemen with your wife, with your brother, with your personal attorney, people who are not employed by the Defense Department, not entitled to receive that kind of information?
I think so. I mean, there's no real way to say this other than maybe he should just say, you know what, I made a mistake. It wasn't classified, but I probably shouldn't have been sending it, and move on. Instead, I think there's a lot of attacks There's impugning of the motives of the people that are reporting this.
Yeah.
I think he'd be safer just to sort of say, hey, you know what? Some mistakes were made. There's an IG's investigation going into this. But here's what I'm trying to do is SecDef, A, B, and C.
Well, of course, he's talking about anonymous leaks here. We saw 4 people shown the door. The person I mentioned, John Elliott, says that there are more bombshells to come, likely in short order, even bigger this week. Does the Pentagon have a leak problem?
It sounds like something is going on for sure, where there are disaffected people across the department. I'm sure there's been a lot of China broken as the new team has taken over.
Yeah.
So maybe what he's referring to is that maybe some uniformed military are going to resign or be fired. Hard to say for sure, but it feels quite rocky over there.
Wow.
Well, and I'm wondering about the leaking coming out of the State Department as well, as the Secretary Marco Rubio pushes back, also as fake news, reporting that there's this kind of draft executive order that is circulating among diplomats that shows how dramatically the administration is considering reshaping the Defense Department. And I wonder, Michael, your specific thoughts on the idea that it could include the closing of a vast number of embassies in Africa. Does that not just cede to China?
Well, I was going to say the same thing. That is the battleground where we are competing with China for influence, the global south. I don't think it's a good idea for us to be shutting down diplomatic offices in Africa. Maybe there's something to be done in Western Europe and Canada, some consulates here and there, where the power has shifted to Asia, or we need to get into Africa. So I don't want to begrudge them. I'm glad they're taking a big strategic look at the State Department. God knows it needs some reform, but I wondered, like you did, about whether Africa was the place where we should be uprooting consulates.
You're a communications specialist as well as a national security expert, which is why we bring you on the program here. If you were trying to clean up a mess here with the Secretary of Defense, a situation like we have today, 2 hit pieces over the weekend, the Signal story, you suggested maybe briefing the press corps at the Pentagon. Would that be as opposed to standing him on the South Lawn at the White House with a big horn playing in the background, cartoon characters, the Easter Bunny jumping around to manage these questions today?
Well, you're making it easy. Yes, I think it would be better.
What do you make of the optics here?
There's so much that the SecDef is in charge of. There are so many things to be talking about, like the reconstitution of the force, how he wants to shift things to Asia and away from Europe. I think he's mostly on the defensive about just showing up for the Ukraine contact group via civets instead of being there in person. He should start to explain his own actions, and I think people will understand that. And that, by the way, is a way for him to try to get some support from what he's doing. He needs support in Congress in particular, so he should start explaining what the policy is, and I think people might come along.
All right, Michael Allen, always good to have you here in our Washington, D.C. studio. He's managing director of Beacon Global Strategies, also former special assistant to President George W. Bush.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.